In the vast darkness of the 41st millennium, where 10,000 years of war have ground empires to dust and legends to myth, there walks a figure who should not exist, a ghost from an age of heroes, returned to a galaxy that has forgotten what heroes were. His name is Lionel Johnson, and he is the first son found, the first warrior to stand at the Emperor's side, the first to be forgotten by history. This is his story, a tale of secrets and shadows, of loyalty tested beyond breaking, of a warrior born in darkness who would spend his entire existence searching for the light. But to understand the Lion, we must first understand where he came from, and perhaps more importantly, what he became in the absence of guidance, in the absence of humanity itself. Picture, if you will, a world called Caliban, not the Caliban of later years, choked by industrialization and stripped of its majesty, but Caliban as it was when the galaxy was young and the Emperor's great work had barely begun. Caliban was a world of endless forests, ancient and deep, where trees grew so tall their canopies formed a second sky, and darkness pooled beneath them like a living thing. These were not the gentle woodlands of civilized worlds. These were forests primeval, predatory, where every shadow might conceal death and every sound might be a warning you would not live to heed again. In these forests dwelled the great beasts of Caliban, not animals, precisely, but something older, something that existed in the space between material and the immaterial. Some were as large as tanks, their hides proof against all but the strongest weapons. Others were smaller, but no less deadly, creatures of pure malice and ancient hunger. The people of Caliban had long since learned to fear the forests, to cluster in their fortified settlements, to venture out only in numbers and only when absolutely necessary. It was into this world that a star fell from the heavens. The infant who would become Lionel Johnson arrived on Caliban not in triumph, but in catastrophe. The scattering of the Primarchs by the Chaos Gods had torn the Emperor's sons from their gestation pods and flung them across the galaxy like seeds in a storm, where some Primarchs landed among civilization, finding foster parents and cultures to shape them. The Lion fell into the deepest, darkest heart of Caliban's forests. There were no humans to find him there, no nurturing hands to raise him. There was only the endless green darkness, the hunting calls of predators, and the instinct to survive. And survive he did. The child did not die in those first hours, though by all rights he should have. He did not freeze in the first night, or starve in the first week, or fall prey to the great beast that surely must have sensed his presence. Instead, something remarkable happened. The infant Primarch, possessed a body and mind far beyond human, began to adapt, not merely to survive, but to thrive in an environment that would have killed any other being 1,000 times over. He learned to move in absolute silence through the undergrowth. He learned which plants could sustain him and which would poison him. He learned to read the forest as others might read a book, every broken twig a sentence, every disturbed leaf a paragraph telling him what passed and where it had gone. He learned to hunt, first small creatures, then larger prey. He learned to hide from the truly deadly predators, and then as he grew, he learned to fight them. Imagine what this did to him. Imagine a mind of transcendent genius, crafted by the Emperor himself to lead humanity's greatest warriors, developing not among philosophers and generals, but among beasts and shadows. The Lion's first language was not High Gothic or any human tongue. It was a language of survival, of threat and dominance, of territory and kill zones. His first lessons were not in tactics or strategy as humans understood them, but in the pure, crystalline logic of predator and prey. And yet, he was still a Primarch, still the Emperor's son, carrying within him purposes and capabilities that even the forests of Caliban could not erase. As he grew from infant to child to young warrior, his mind began to work on problems no beast could comprehend. He began to think not just about surviving the next hunt, but about patterns, about the territories of the great beasts, about which creatures were truly threats and which were merely dangerous, about the nature of the forest itself. Years passed. The child became a youth, tall and strong beyond any human measure. His hair grew long and wild, the color of a lion's mane, though he would not know the significance of that for years to come. His eyes, green as the forest canopy, became hard and watchful, missing nothing, trusting nothing. He wore no clothes but what he could fashion from the hides of his kills. He carried no weapons but what he could craft from bone and stone and salvage metal, though his hands themselves had become weapons, capable of tearing through flesh and breaking bone. By the time the young lion was 10 years old, though he had no concept of years or ages, he had become the apex predator of his region of the forest. The great beast that had once hunted freely in that territory learned to avoid the pale shadow that moved through the darkness. Some he killed when they challenged him or when he needed food. Others he simply drove away, establishing a dominion over the forest that was instinctive and absolute. But he was alone, utterly, completely alone in a way that would mark him forever. It was a hunting party from the Order that finally found him. The Order was Caliban's greatest institution, a knightly brotherhood dedicated to protecting humanity from the great beasts. They wore powered armor scavenged and maintained from the dark age of technology. They carried weapons that could fell even the mightiest creatures. They were Caliban's heroes, the finest warriors the planet could produce, and they ventured into the deep forest to call the great beasts before they could threaten human settlements. Luther was leading the party that day. Luther, who would become the second most important figure in the lion's life, second only to the emperor himself, though for very different reasons. Luther was young then, but already renowned as one of the Order's finest warriors. He was charismatic, beloved by his brothers, a natural leader who inspired loyalty and affection wherever he went. He was everything the lion was not: human, socialized, connected to others. The hunting party had tracked a particularly dangerous great beast deep into uncharted territory. They were following its trail through a section of forest where even the Order rarely ventured, when Luther saw something that made him raise his hand, bringing his brothers to a halt. Movement, not the heavy, lumbering movement of a great beast, but something different, something that moved like water, like shadow, like death itself gliding between the trees. And then they saw him. The young lion emerged from the forest like something from a fevered dream. He was perhaps 10 years old by the reckoning they would later apply, but already tall as a man, with the build of a warrior who had spent every day of his life fighting for survival. His hair was long and tangled with leaves and forest debris. His body was covered in scars, each one a lesson learned, a death narrowly avoided. He wore scraps of hide and carried a crude spear, but his eyes, those were what caught Luther's attention. Those eyes were intelligent, aware, not the eyes of feral child or a beast man, but the eyes of someone who was thinking, calculating, evaluating the threat they posed. The hunting party froze. They had never seen anything like him. Was he human? Some mutation? A survivor from a lost settlement, driven mad by isolation? Luther stepped forward slowly, his hands away from his weapons, speaking in soft, calming tones. The lion watched him come. Every muscle in his body was coiled, ready to fight or flee. But something in Luther's approach, something in his body language and tone, spoke to a part of the lion's mind that had been dormant all these years. The part that recognized another intelligent being. The part that craved, though he did not know the word for it, connection. What followed was not a rescue or a capture, but negotiation conducted not in words, for the lion had none, but in gestures and actions and the subtle language of trust slowly earned. Luther sat down, deliberately making himself vulnerable. He removed his helmet, showing his face. He offered food and water. He made no sudden moves. The lion did not approach, but he did not leave either. Luther returned the next day, and the next, always alone now, having left his brothers behind, driven by an instinct he could not quite name. Each time, he would sit in the same clearing, offer food, speak in quiet tones even though the wild boy could not understand his words. And each time, the lion watched in the shadows, silent and wary but present. It took weeks before the lion finally approached close enough to take food directly from Luther's hand. It took months before he would tolerate Luther's touch, before the first rudimentary attempts at communication began. Luther started teaching him language, pointing at objects and speaking their names, over and over with infinite patience. Tree, rock, water, sky, brother, and slowly, laboriously, the lion began to speak. The first words he learned were not the poetic phrases of Caliban's knights, but simple, functional terms. But with each word came understanding, and with understanding came a bridge back to the humanity he had never known. Luther continued to visit, never forcing, never demanding, simply being present. And the lion, for the first time in his life, experienced something other than solitude. It was Luther who finally convinced him to return to the fortress monastery of the order. It was Luther who vouched for him before the Grand Masters, who argued that this strange wild warrior should be given a chance. It was Luther who became his teacher, his guide, his only friend in a world of men that must have seemed as alien to the lion as the forest had been to them. The lion learned with frightening speed. What took normal aspirants years to master, he absorbed in months. Reading, writing, mathematics, history, philosophy, all of it poured into his vast intellect and was immediately integrated, processed, understood. But it was in the arts of war that he truly excelled. The tactical primers of the order were written by men who had fought the great beasts for generations, refining their techniques through hard experience. The lion read them and immediately saw their flaws, their inefficiencies, their blind spots. Within weeks of learning to read, he was writing his own treatises, describing tactics and strategies that left the veteran Grand Masters stunned with their elegance and effectiveness. When he was given his first suit of power armor and sent on his first official hunt, he moved through the forest like a force of nature. The great beast they had been tracking, a creature that had killed dozens of knights over the years, felled his blade in a battle that lasted less than a minute. He had understood its movements, predicted its attacks, exploited its weaknesses with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. But there was something the Order's masters began to notice about the lion, something that troubled them even as they marveled at his abilities. He did not celebrate his victories. He did not boast or seek glory. He did not seem to crave the camaraderie that was so central to the Order's culture. He was alone, even in a room full of his brothers. He was separate, isolated by something more profound than mere shyness or reserve. Only with Luther did he seem to lower his guard. Only with Luther did he speak freely, sharing his thoughts and observations. And Luther, for his part, became the lion's champion, his advocate, his constant defender. When others whispered about the wild warrior's strange ways, Luther silenced them. When the lion's directness offended the proud knights, Luther smoothed things over. They became inseparable, as close as brothers, though there was always an indefinable distance between them. Luther gave freely of his affection and received something else in return. Not affection precisely, but trust, loyalty, the most the lion seemed capable of giving. The years passed, and the lion's reputation grew. Hunt after hunt, he proved himself not just effective but extraordinary. He began to lead expeditions into the deepest forests, into territories where even the Order had never ventured. He hunted great beasts that had been thought unkillable. Under his leadership, the forests that had threatened Caliban for millennia began to recede for the first time. His rise to the Order's ranks was meteoric. Knight Commander, Master. Each promotion came not through political maneuvering or social graces. The lion had neither the interest nor the aptitude for such things, but through sheer, undeniable competence. When he planned a campaign, it succeeded. When he led a hunt, the beast died. It was that simple, that absolute. But his methods troubled some of the older masters. The lion fought without honor, they said. He used ambushes and traps. He studied his enemies and exploited their weaknesses rather than meeting them in fair combat. He sent knights to die if it served the tactical necessity of the moment. He was effective, brutally so, but there was something cold in his calculations, something that seemed to place the mission above the men who served it. Luther defended him always. Luther explained that the lion had learned to survive in the forest, where honor meant nothing and only results mattered. Luther argued that they should be grateful for his effectiveness rather than questioning his methods. And the Order listened because Luther was beloved and charismatic, and because the results were undeniable. In time, the lion rose to become Grand Master of the Order, the youngest ever to hold the position. He stood atop the highest tower of the fortress monastery and looked out over the forests of Caliban, forests that were quieter now, less dangerous, pushed back by his relentless campaigns. And he felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, only the awareness that the work continued, that there were always more beasts to hunt, more threats to eliminate. What he did not know, what he could not know, was that high above Caliban's skies, a golden vessel was descending. The Emperor had come to Caliban. The Emperor had found his first lost son. The meeting between the Emperor and the lion was unlike any of the other Primarch reunions. When the Emperor found Gilliman, he found a statesman building an empire. When he found Russ, he found a king surrounded by loyal warriors. When he found Sanguinius, he found an angel worshipped by his people. But when he found the lion, he found a predator standing alone on a parapet, studying the forest below with the cold calculation of a hunter evaluating his territory. The Emperor knew him immediately. Of course, this was his son, his first, the prototype upon which all the others had been based. He saw in the lion the echoes of his own design, the strategic brilliance, the physical perfection, the transcendent capabilities that marked all the Primarchs. But he also saw what Caliban had made of him, the isolation, the wariness, the mind that thought like a hunter because it had learned to survive as prey. Their first conversation, if it could be called that, was brief and functional. The Emperor explained who he was, what the lion was, and what purpose awaited him. The lion listened with that same calculating gaze. He turned on everything else, processing, evaluating, deciding. And when the Emperor finished, the lion asked one question: "What do you require of me?" Not, "Are you truly my father?" Not, "Where have you been?" Not, "Why was I left alone?" Just a practical question, the tactical question, the question of a weapon asking for its target. The Emperor, who had lived for millennia and thought he understood all the permutations of human nature, felt something he rarely experienced, a moment of sadness for what his son had become. But he answered truthfully, "I require you to lead, to command my first legion, to bring the galaxy into compliance with humanity's manifest destiny, to be my sword in the darkness." The lion considered this. Then he nodded once, sharply, accepting the mission as he would accept any other hunt. And thus was the First Legion reunited with its Primarch, the Dark Angels reborn under the leadership of the Lion. But first, there was Caliban to finish. The Emperor remained on Caliban for a time, observing his son, evaluating what manner of weapon he had recovered, and he watched as the Lion did something unprecedented. The Lion gathered the order, explained what had happened and what it meant, and then proposed something the Emperor himself had not suggested, that Caliban itself would join the Imperium, that its knights would become the recruitment base for First Legion, that the world would be transformed from a death world into a fortress of humanity. But more than that, the Lion proposed that together he and the Order would hunt down every last great beast on Caliban, not push them back, not contain them, eliminate them utterly. It took 3 years. 3 years of the most intensive campaign Caliban had ever seen, with the Lion leading combined forces of his new Space Marine Legion and the Order's Knights. The Emperor provided resources, weapon, and orbital support, but he let his son plan and execute the campaign. And the Emperor, who was no stranger to war, found himself impressed by what he witnessed. The Lion fought like no other commander the Emperor had ever seen. He was not Horus, who led from the front and inspired through personal charisma. He was not Gilliman, who built systematic processes and logistics chains. He was not Russ, who unleashed controlled fury upon his enemies. The Lion fought like a lion. He was patient when patience served. He was savage when savagery was required. He studied his enemies with obsessive focus, learning their patterns, finding their weaknesses, and then striking with absolute precision at the moment of maximum effectiveness. When a particularly powerful great beast proved resistant to conventional weapons, the Lion spent 3 months tracking it, studying it, learning its territory and behavior. Then, in a single night, he led a team into the creature's lair during its torpor cycle and killed it before it could fully wake. The entire operation took less than an hour. A threat that could have cost hundreds of lives was eliminated with 0 casualties. This became his pattern. Minimal losses, maximum effect, cold, calculated precision over glory or honor. His legion learned to fight in his image, patient, thorough, ruthless in the moment of strike. They became the Emperor's problem solvers, the legion you sent when failure was not an option, and you didn't care how messy the solution needed to be. When Caliban was finally cleansed and the last great beast lay dead, the Lion departed for the stars with his legion, but he made a decision that would echo through millennia to come. He left Luther behind. Oh! It was dressed in honor and necessity. Someone needed to command the fortress monastery. Someone needed to oversee the recruitment and training of new aspirants. Someone needed to govern Caliban in the Lion's absence. Luther was a natural choice, beloved, respected, capable. The Lion presented it as a position of trust and importance. But Luther, who knew the Lion better than anyone, understood the truth. He was being left behind because he was human, because he could not be enhanced to full Astartes status, being too old when the process became available, because no matter how skilled he was, he would never be able to keep pace with a Primarch and his gene sons. The Lion was moving forward into a galaxy of war, and Luther, for all his prowess, was being left behind. The Lion did not seem to understand why Luther took this so hard. It was simply a practical decision, a logical allocation of resources. But then, the Lion had never truly understood the emotional needs of others. How could he, when he had spent his formative years among beasts? And so the First Legion set forth into the Great Crusade, and behind them on Caliban, a seed of resentment was planted that would one day grow into betrayal. The Lion approached the Great Crusade like he approached everything else, as a problem to be solved with maximum efficiency. While other Primarchs sought glory or built empires or spread their philosophies across the stars, the Lion simply fought. He took the compliance orders he was given, planned his campaigns with meticulous care, and executed them with brutal precision. His record of success was unmatched. System after system fell to the First Legion, brought into the Imperial fold with fewer casualties and faster timelines than almost any other legion achieved. The Lion did not care about making grand statements or leaving monuments to his glory. He cared about results. But this very efficiency created a problem. The Lion was successful, devastatingly so, but he was not celebrated. He did not gather a following of remembrancers to chronicle his deeds. He did not cultivate relationships with the administratum or the Imperial Army commanders. He did not build a political base or seek recognition for his achievements. He simply did the work and moved on to the next target. And so, despite being the first, despite his record of success, the Lion found himself increasingly overshadowed by his more charismatic brothers. Horus was named War Master. Guilliman built an empire within the Imperium. Sanguinius was beloved by all. Even Russ, savage and rough, had his saga poet spreading tales of his deeds. The Lion was simply there, dependable, effective, forgotten. If there was one thing the Lion struggled with more than anything else, it was his relationships with his brother Primarchs. He had never learned how to connect with others, how to read social cues, how to build a bond of friendship or brotherhood. He approached his brothers as he approached everything else, analytically, tactically, trying to understand their patterns and predict their actions. This did not make him popular. With Horus, who would become War Master, the Lion had a relationship of mutual respect but little warmth. Horus recognized the Lion's capabilities and valued him as an asset in the Great Crusade. The Lion recognized Horus's political acumen and his effectiveness as a leader, but there was no real friendship there, no deep bond. When Horus was named War Master instead of the Lion, despite the Lion being first, the Lion accepted it without protest. It was a logical choice, he reasoned. Horus was better at managing people, at politics, at inspiration. The Lion was better at war. That Horus would coordinate while the Lion executed seemed like an efficient division of labor. What the Lion did not understand was that this should have hurt, that being passed over despite being first, despite his record, despite everything he had accomplished, should have wounded his pride. But the Lion had no pride in that sense, or rather, his pride was so deeply buried beneath layers of practical thinking that he genuinely did not recognize it. With Robot Guilliman, the Lion had a relationship that could best be described as complicated. Guilliman was everything the Lion was not: systematic, organized, building lasting institutions and philosophies. Guilliman left behind him not just conquered worlds, but reformed civilizations, integrated into the Imperium through carefully designed administrative structures. The Lion left behind him compliant worlds that met Imperial standards and nothing more. Guilliman tried, initially, to befriend the Lion. He recognized a kindred spirit in some ways. Both were tactical geniuses, both valued efficiency, both took the Great Crusade seriously. But Guilliman's attempt at friendship founded on the Lion's inability to reciprocate in any meaningful way. The Lion did not dismiss Guilliman, but nor did he welcome his overtures. He simply didn't seem to understand what Guilliman wanted from him. In time, this would curdle into something like rivalry, though not in the traditional sense. Guilliman came to see the Lion as aloof and arrogant, too good to engage with his brothers. The Lion came to see Guilliman as obsessed with paperwork and empire building rather than the actual work of conquest. Neither understanding was entirely fair, but both were based on genuine observations filtered through their own perspectives. But it was with Leman Russ that the lion had his most volatile relationship. Russ, the wolf king of Fenris, was in many ways the lion's opposite. Where the lion was cold and calculating, Russ was passionate and instinctive. Where the lion kept his own counsel, Russ wore his heart on his sleeve. Where the lion fought like a hunter, Russ fought like a berserker. They should have respected each other's differences. Instead, they clashed. The exact origins of their rivalry are lost to legend and conflicting accounts. But the pattern was clear enough. Russ thought the lion too cold, too removed, too willing to sacrifice honor for efficiency. The lion thought Russ too reckless, too governed by emotion, too willing to take unnecessary risks for the sake of glory. Their most famous conflict came over a matter that, in hindsight, seems almost trivial. Both the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves have been pursuing the same target, a system whose compliance would represent a significant strategic victory. The Lion, through careful planning and preparation, managed to reach the system first and bring it into compliance before Russ even arrived. When Russ discovered this, he was furious. He accused the Lion of stealing his glory, of caring more about personal victory than brotherhood. The Lion, genuinely confused by this reaction, pointed out that he had simply accomplished the mission efficiently. The system was compliant. The Imperium had expanded. What did it matter which legion took the credit? This, of course, was exactly the wrong thing to say. The confrontation escalated. Words were exchanged. Then blows. The two Primarchs fought each other right there on the world they had both come to conquer, their legions watching in shock as their gene fathers battled. They fought for a full day and night, neither able to gain decisive advantage over the other, until finally both collapsed in exhaustion. And then something remarkable happened. Russ, lying on his back and breathing hard, began to laugh. It started small, then built into huge, gasping guffaws of genuine mirth. He thought the entire situation absurd. Two of the Emperor's sons beating each other bloody over a misunderstanding, while their actual enemies cowered in fear. The Lion, lying a few feet away, did not laugh. He did not see the humor. He stood, cold and silent, and walked away without a word. To him, it had been a serious conflict requiring resolution through combat. That Russ could laugh it off seemed to prove the Wolf King's lack of seriousness, his inability to understand when something truly mattered. From that day forward, there was no love lost between them. They would cooperate when required, but the frost between them never thawed, and the Lion, for perhaps the first time, felt something like what lesser beings called hurt. Not that he would have recognized it or acknowledged it even to himself. Of all the relationships in the Lion's life, perhaps the most complex was his relationship with his father, the Emperor. The Lion revered the Emperor. How could he not? The Emperor had given him purpose, mission, meaning beyond mere survival. The Emperor had revealed to him what he was meant to be. The Emperor had provided with the tools and resources to accomplish things far beyond what he could have achieved alone on Caliban. In the Lion's analytical mind, the Emperor represented ultimate authority and ultimate capability, a being worthy of absolute loyalty. But the Lion did not love the Emperor, not in any way that would be recognizable as filial affection. He could not. Love required an emotional availability that his childhood had burned out of him. What the Lion felt for the Emperor was something colder, something more absolute. It was the loyalty of a weapon to its wielder, the dedication of a tool to its purpose. The Emperor, for his part, seemed to understand this. He did not demand love from a Lion. He did not expect warmth or affection. He gave the Lion missions, resources, and autonomy, and the Lion delivered results. It was a functional relationship, perhaps the most functional of all the emperor's relationships with his sons, precisely because it made no pretense of being anything other than what it was. But there were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when one might have glimpsed something more. When the lion would receive a commendation from the emperor for a particularly successful campaign, there would be the slightest straightening of his spine, the faintest glimmer in his eyes that might have been pride. When the emperor called him my son rather than my first, there would be the briefest pause, as if some part of the lion was trying to understand what those words should mean to him. The emperor noticed these moments, and perhaps he wondered, in his own way, what his first son might have become if he had landed anywhere but Caliban's forests, if he had been raised by humans, if he had learned to connect with others before he learned to hunt and kill. But the emperor was a pragmatist above all else, and he had no time for hypotheticals. The lion was what he was, a perfect weapon, absolutely loyal, devastatingly effective. That would have to be enough, and for the lion it was enough. He asked for nothing more from the emperor than missions and the resources to complete them. In a strange way, their relationship was perhaps the healthiest of all the Primarch-Emperor bonds, precisely because it was based on clear expectations and mutual understanding rather than complicated emotional needs that could never be fully satisfied. The Great Crusade ground on. Year after year, decade after decade, the Imperium expanded across the galaxy, and the lion was always there at the front, leading his first legion in campaign after campaign. He did not seek out the biggest threats or the most glorious victories. He simply took the assignments he was given and executed them with his characteristic precision. But something was changing in the galaxy, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. Campaigns that should have been straightforward became complicated. Compliant worlds began to rebel. There were reports of strange cults, of systems falling to unknown corruption. Horus, the war master, seemed increasingly troubled, increasingly isolated in his command. The lion noticed these patterns. His analytical mind was designed to detect such things, to recognize when the expected was becoming the anomalous. He reported his observations through proper channels, suggested increased vigilance, recommended additional resources be allocated to investigation and counterintelligence. His recommendations were filed away and largely ignored. The Imperium was too vast, too complex, too confident in its inevitable triumph. A few setbacks would be expected in a crusade of such magnitude. There was no need for alarm. But the lion remained uneasy. Something was wrong. He could feel it the way he had once felt the presence of predators in Caliban's forests. Something was watching. Something was waiting. Something was about to strike. He just didn't know what. When news reached the lion that Horus had rebelled against the emperor, his first reaction was not shock or disbelief or emotional turmoil. His first reaction was tactical analysis. He was on the far side of the galaxy, engaged in compliance operations in a region called the Thramas sector. The news took time to reach him, delayed by warp storms and communication difficulties. By the time he learned of Horus's betrayal, the War Master's forces were already well into their campaign. Several legions had declared for him, and the galaxy was splitting into civil war. The lion immediately began calculating. He evaluated his position, his resources, his strategic situation. He considered his options. He could move his legion toward Terra, attempting to reinforce the Emperor directly. He could move against Horus's forces, striking at the rebels wherever he could find them. He could secure his own position and wait for clearer intelligence on who was loyal and who had turned traitor. What he did not do, what never even occurred to him to do, was agonize over why Horus had betrayed the Emperor. He did not waste time on questions of motivation or philosophy or the underlying causes of the heresy. Horus was a traitor. That was all that mattered. The lion would oppose him with every resource at his disposal, but his very first actions in the heresy would come to define how others viewed him, and would plant seeds of doubt that would haunt him ever after. The lion made the practical decision to secure his immediate area of operations before committing to any larger strategic movement. This meant dealing with the Night Lord's Legion, who held a significant presence in the Thramas sector and whose Primarch, Conrad Kurz, had declared for Horus. What followed was the Thramas Crusade, 3 years of brutal warfare between the First Legion and the Eighth. It was a campaign fought in the darkness between stars, a war of ambushes and counter-ambushes, of fleet actions and boarding actions, of void warfare at its most savage. The Lion and Kurz, 2 Primarchs who had both learned to hunt before they learned to lead, stalked each other across a dozen systems. The Lion fought this campaign with his characteristic efficiency, grinding down the Night Lords through superior logistics and strategic positioning. But the very fact that he had committed to this campaign at all raised questions. Why was the Lion fighting the Night Lords in the Thramas sector when Terra itself was under threat? Why was he engaging in what some saw as a sideshow when the fate of the Imperium hung in the balance? The Lion's answer, when challenged, was coldly logical. The Night Lords represented a significant strategic threat. If left unchecked, they could have cut off entire sectors from Imperial control, isolated loyal forces, and generally created chaos in the Emperor's rear areas. Eliminating them was a tactically sound choice before committing to any larger operations. But to some, especially to those who thought in terms of honor and glory rather than pure tactics, it looked like a Lion was playing it safe. Or worse, like he was waiting to see which side would win before committing himself fully. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The Lion's loyalty was absolute, unquestionable, but his methods were his own, and he would not be rushed into strategically unsound decisions just to make a grand gesture. He would fight the war his way, with maximum efficiency and minimum wasted resources. If others questioned his choices, that was their problem. The campaign against the Night Lords brought the Lion face to face with perhaps the only brother who truly understood what he had become on Caliban. Conrad Kurz was, in his own way, as damaged as a lion, raised on a world of darkness and crime. Kurz had learned to see humanity at its worst. He had become a creature of terror and justice, dealing out death with the absolute certainty of a prophet who had seen every possible future and found them all wanting. When the Lion and Kurz finally met in personal combat, aboard a crippled starship drifting in the void, something passed between them that neither would ever fully articulate. They fought in darkness. 2 hunters who had learned their craft in shadows, each perfectly suited to this form of combat. They fought for hours, tearing through bulkheads and corridors, neither able to gain decisive advantage. And during that fight, Kurz spoke. He always did when he fought. He spoke of visions and futures, of the inevitability of betrayal, of the darkness that lived in the heart of every human enterprise. He spoke of what he had seen in his prophetic dreams. Futures where the Lion's choices led to disaster, where his inability to trust or be trusted led to the downfall of his own legion. "You and I are the same," Kurz hissed, his words bubbling through blood and torn flesh. "We both learned that the only law is survival. The only truth is strength. The only certainty is death. You dress it up in honor and duty. But underneath, you're just like me, a killer who learned to kill before he learned to be anything else." The Lion did not respond with words. He drove his fist through a bulkhead, trying to reach Kurz's position. But perhaps something in those words struck home, reached some part of him that he kept buried so deep even he didn't acknowledge its existence. Perhaps Kurz was right. Perhaps there was a darkness in the Lion that he had never fully confronted, a savagery left over from his years in Caliban's forest that he had simply channeled into more acceptable forms but never truly transcended. The fight ended not in decisive victory but in escape. Kurz disappeared into the darkness of the dying ship, vanishing like a ghost while his legion fled the sector. The Lion had won the Thrama's crusade strategically, but the Night Lords had not been destroyed. Kurz remained at large, a shadow haunting the galaxy's darkness. And the Lion, standing in the ruins of the ship, felt something he had not felt in years, not since Caliban, a sense that he was not so different from the beasts he had once hunted, that the line between predator and civilized being was thinner than he had let himself believe. He dismissed the feeling. There was work to be done. With the Thrama's sector secured, the Lion finally turned his legion toward Terra. But he was cautious, perhaps too cautious. He had received fragmentary reports of other legions declaring for Horus, of Primarchs he had thought loyal turning traitor. He had learned, in Caliban's forest, that the most dangerous moments were when you thought you knew where all the predators were. So he moved carefully, securing his route, establishing supply lines, gathering intelligence. He sent scouts ahead to determine who held which systems, who could be trusted, who might turn on him if he let his guard down. And all the while, Terra burned. The siege had begun. Horus's forces were hammering at humanity's birth world, while the Lion was still weeks, perhaps months away, moving with what some would later call excessive caution. But then something happened that would define the Lion's entire relationship with his own legion, that would split the Dark Angels in a way they would never fully heal. Word reached him from Caliban, urgent, fragmentary, but unmistakable. Luther had declared independence. The reports were confused, contradictory. Some said Luther had declared for Horus. Some said he had rejected both Emperor and War Master, claiming Caliban for itself. Some said the planet was in civil war, loyalists and traitor forces battling each other in the streets. But all agreed on one thing. Luther, the Lion's closest friend, his brother in all but blood, had betrayed him. The Lion's response was immediate and absolute. He diverted his entire legion toward Caliban. He abandoned his approach to Terra, left other loyalist forces without the support they desperately needed, and set course for his homeworld with every ship he could muster. To this day, scholars debate this decision. Some call it the act of a broken-hearted warrior, choosing personal loyalty over duty. Others call it a tactical necessity. How could a Lion leave a traitor force in his rear area with access to all the Dark Angels' recruitment and resource infrastructure? Still others whispered darker theories, suggesting the Lion feared what secrets Luther might reveal about Caliban, about the Dark Angels, about the thing that had happened in the forest long ago. The Lion himself offered no explanation. He simply went. The Lion's fleet emerged from the warp to find Caliban's orbital defenses primed and ready. Attempts at communication were met with silence, or, worse, with demands that he state his loyalty to the Emperor or to Horus. The Lion had no patience for such games. He gave one order. Anyone who stood between him and Luther would be destroyed. What followed was not a battle, but an apocalypse. The Lion's fleet bombarded the orbital fortresses until they were ruins. They broke through the defensive perimeter and began landing troops directly onto Caliban's surface. And as Dark Angels descended to fight Dark Angels, brother against brother, the Lion himself teleported directly into the fortress monastery that had once been his first real home. He found Luther waiting for him in the highest tower, in the very room where the Lion had once stood as Grand Master of the Order, looking out over the forest he had tamed. Luther had changed. That much was immediately obvious. Whatever had happened to him during the Lion's absence, whatever darkness had taken root in his heart, It had transformed him. He stood taller now, augmented somehow beyond normal human capabilities. His eyes glowed with unnatural power. He radiated strength that he should not have possessed. But worse than the physical changes was the look in his eyes. The lion, who had never been good at reading emotional states, could still recognize one thing with absolute clarity: hatred. Luther looked at him with pure, distilled hatred, the kind that comes from years of resentment allowed to fester and rot. "You left me," Luther said, his voice carrying unnaturally through the chamber. "You took everything I gave you, everything I taught you, and you left me behind to wither on this rock while you chased glory across the stars." The lion honestly didn't understand. You were needed here. The Legion required. The Legion? Luther's shout cracked like thunder. "I gave you humanity. I gave you language, culture, civilization. I made you more than a beast. And you repaid me by leaving me behind because I wasn't good enough, wasn't enhanced enough, wasn't one of the Emperor's perfect sons." And there, in that moment, the lion finally understood something he'd been blind to for decades. Luther had not betrayed him because of some grand philosophical disagreement with the Emperor's vision, or because chaos had corrupted him, or because of any great cause. Luther had betrayed him because of hurt, because of feeling abandoned, discarded, left behind by the person he cared most about. The lion, who had never learned to understand or value emotional needs, had wounded his closest friend in a way he had never recognized. And that wound had metastasized into treason. "I never meant." The lion began, and for perhaps the first time in his life, he struggled to find words for something that wasn't tactical or strategic. "You were my brother, are my brother. I trusted you with everything that mattered. Everything but yourself," Luther said, and there was something like pain beneath the hatred now. "You never let me in, lion. Not really. I gave you everything. You gave me duty, responsibility, purpose, but never yourself. You stand there even now, and I can see you calculating, analyzing, trying to figure out how to defeat me rather than trying to understand how we got here." It was true. Even in this moment, part of the lion's mind was indeed assessing threats, calculating angles, preparing for combat. He couldn't help it. It was how he was built, how Caliban had shaped him. And Luther, who knew him better than anyone, saw it clearly. "It's too late for understanding," Luther said, and power began to crackle around him, the taint of chaos made manifest. "I didn't bring you here to reconcile. I brought you here to destroy you, to take from you what you took from me, everything." And then they fought. The battle between the lion and Luther was nothing like the fight with curs. That had been a battle between two hunters, technical and precise. This was something primal, something that transcended mere combat. This was betrayal and heartbreak given physical form. Two warriors who had once been closer than brothers trying to tear each other apart. Luther fought with power that should not have been his, channeling energies from the warp that augmented his every blow. The lion fought with the cold fury of a warrior who had been betrayed by someone he trusted absolutely. They tore through the tower, through walls and floors, the entire structure shaking with the force of their conflict. And even as they fought, Caliban itself began to die. The orbital bombardment continued. The Dark Angel's fleet, receiving no orders to cease fire, methodically destroyed the fortress monasteries, the training grounds, the recruitment centers. They bombarded from orbit with such intensity that the planet's crust began to crack. Tectonic instability spread. Volcanoes that had been dormant for millennia erupted. The forests that the lion had spent years cleansing began to burn. Some say it was a lion who ordered this destruction, a cold tactical decision to deny the traitors their base. Some say it was Luther's use of chaos powers that tore the fabric of reality, causing the planet itself to unravel. Some say both are true, that the lion's assault and Luther's corruption worked together to destroy the world that had made them both. In the tower, neither warrior noticed the destruction outside. They were too focused on each other, on this final reckoning of a relationship that had never been what either of them needed it to be. Luther struck the lion with a blast of warp energy that would have killed a lesser being. The lion felt his primary heart stop, felt his body begin to shut down. But he was a Primarch, and his transhuman physiology was designed for exactly such extremes. His secondary heart took over. His body flooded with combat stimulants. He forced himself to keep moving, keep fighting. He drove his fist into Luther's chest hard enough to crack ribs, hard enough to break bone. He followed with his sword, the lion sword, one of the Emperor's own gifts, driving it toward Luther's heart. But even as his blade fell, something happened. The warp energies around Luther surged, uncontrolled, backlashing. Whatever dark power had sustained him suddenly withdrew, leaving him suddenly, painfully human once more. The lion's blow, which would have killed the chaos-empowered warrior, instead nearly killed an ordinary man. The lion pulled his strike at the last instant, the blade stopping mere inches from Luther's heart. And in that moment of mercy, in that instant where he chose not to kill the man who betrayed him, the warp itself erupted. What exactly happened next is lost of legend and contradictory accounts. Some say the warp rift opened beneath the lion, drawing him into its depths. Some say the Watchers in the Dark, mysterious Xenos creatures that had inhabited Caliban since time immemorial, intervened to save him from Luther's final attack. Some say the Emperor himself reached out across the galaxy to preserve his first son. All that is known for certain is this. When the dust settled and survivors emerged from the ruins, Luther was found collapsed and insane, weeping and laughing by turns, speaking in fragments about what he had done. And the lion was gone, vanished, disappeared without a trace, as if he had never been there at all. The dark angels searched the ruins. They tore apart what remained of the tower. They scoured every fragment of debris, every collapsed chamber, but they found nothing. No body, no trace, no sign of their Primarch except the lion's sword, found embedded in the floor where he had made his final stand. And Caliban itself was dying. The planet was breaking apart, great chunks of its surface tearing away into space. The Dark Angel's fleet retreated, taking with them everyone they could evacuate, but millions died as the world tore itself apart. In the end, only a fragment remained, a rock in space that would be renamed the Rock, that would become the mobile fortress monastery of the Dark Angels for the next 10,000 years. But worse than the physical destruction was the corruption that had taken root in the Legion itself. Half of the Dark Angels on Caliban had sided with Luther. Now, as the planet died, many of them escaped into the warp, scattered across time and space, becoming the Fallen, traitors who had betrayed their Primarch and their Legion, and who would spend the next 10 millennia being hunted by their former brothers. The lion, had he been present, might have understood this with perfect clarity. His greatest victory on Caliban, the cleansing of the great beast, had left behind a different kind of darkness, the taint of chaos, feeding on resentment and abandonment, had grown where the natural predators had been eliminated, and that darkness had consumed the very people he had tried to save. But the lion was not present. The lion was gone, disappeared into whatever fate the warp and the emperors would have decreed for him. The heresy ground on toward its conclusion. Terra burned. The emperor fought Horus aboard the War Master's flagship. The loyalist Primarchs who were present fought their way through waves of traitors. And the First Legion, the Dark Angels, were not there. They were far away, dealing with the destruction of their homeworld, searching desperately for their lost Primarch, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. When the heresy finally ended with Horus defeated and the Emperor entombed on the golden throne, the Dark Angels returned to the shattered Imperium bearing shame they could never fully express. They had not been at Terra. Their Primarch was gone. Half their legion had turned traitor. They were first in name, but they had failed in the moment that mattered most. The other legions never quite let them forget it. Oh! No one accused them of treachery. The Dark Angels' loyalty during the heresy was without question, even if their deployment had been questionable. But there were always whispers. Why hadn't they been at Terra? Where had the Lion gone? What had really happened on Caliban? And the Dark Angels themselves became consumed by a secret shame that would define them for the next 10,000 years. The existence of the Fallen, their traitor brothers who had escaped into the warp, became the Legion's darkest secret. They could never admit it, could never acknowledge that fully half the Dark Angels on Caliban had turned against the Lion. Such an admission would destroy the Legion's reputation entirely, would cast doubt on their loyalty, would invalidate everything they had fought for. So they began to hunt. Quietly, secretly, obsessively, they hunted the Fallen. Whenever rumors of Chaos Marines matching Dark Angels' descriptions rose, they diverted their forces to investigate. They interrogated prisoners in their hidden chambers. They chased leads across the galaxy, sometimes abandoning Imperial forces in mid-battle if it meant capturing one of their wayward brothers. The rest of the Imperium noticed, of course. The Dark Angels' strange behavior, their paranoia, their secretiveness, all of it created suspicion. But the Dark Angels could never explain. To explain would be to admit the truth. So they remained silent, aloof, trusted by none and trusting none in return. They had become, in a way, exactly like their Primarch, isolated, secretive, efficient at their core purpose, but unable to build meaningful connections with others. The Lion's personality had imprinted itself on his legion, and without him to lead them, they had amplified his worst traits rather than his best. The decades became centuries. The centuries became millennia. The Imperium slowly recovered from the heresy, though it would never again reach the heights of its glory during the Great Crusade. The Space Marine legions were broken up into chapters according to the Codex Astartes. The Dark Angels became a first founding chapter, with their successor chapters, the Unforgiven, sharing their secret shame and their obsessive hunt for the Fallen. And through all of it, there were rumors about the Lion. Some said he was dead, killed by Luther and his body lost in Caliban's destruction. Some said he was in stasis, somewhere, hidden by the Watchers in the dark, healing from wounds that would have killed anyone else. Some said he was in the warp, trapped in some hell dimension, unable to return. Some whispered that he had simply left, abandoned a galaxy that had never appreciated him, gone to fight wars in distant reaches where his talents would be properly valued. The Dark Angels themselves did not know. The Watchers in the dark, those mysterious Xenos creatures who had haunted Caliban and now haunted the Rock, remained silent on the matter. The Supreme Grand Masters of the chapter, privy to the deepest secrets of the Legion, knew only that their Primarch had disappeared and that his fate remained uncertain. As the 41st millennium dawned and the galaxy grew darker, as the Imperium crumbled at the edges and chaos spread like wildfire, there were those who prayed for the Lion's return. There were those who hoped that the First would come back to lead his sons in humanity's darkest hour. There were those who maintained faith that their Primarch lived still, waiting for the moment when he was truly needed. But hope is a cruel thing in the 41st millennium. And as the years stretched into millennia with no sign of the Lion, even the faithful began to doubt. Perhaps he was simply gone. Perhaps the galaxy would have to face its end without him. And then, after 10,000 years of darkness, something changed. Deep within the rock, in chambers that had not been opened in millennia, something stirred. The watchers in the dark felt it first. They gathered in unprecedented numbers in the deepest levels of the fortress monastery, in places where even the chapter master was not permitted to go. They waited, patient and eternal, as they had waited for 10,000 years. And in a chamber sealed since the heresy, wrapped in technologies both Imperial and Xenos, hidden behind wards and defenses that would have killed any who tried to pass them, a single heart began to beat. Then another, a body that had been still as death for 10 millennia, began slowly to heal. Wounds that would have killed any other being that had indeed been intended to kill began to close. Flesh knit, bone mended, systems that had shut down to preserve life in the face of catastrophic trauma gradually, cautiously, began to come back online. The process took years. Not the sudden awakening of legend, but a gradual, painful return to life. The Lion's transhuman physiology, combined with the technologies the Watchers had used to preserve him, worked together to bring him back from the very brink of death. And as he healed, he dreamed. He dreamed of Caliban's forests, of hunting in darkness, of the pure simplicity of survival. He dreamed of Luther, of brotherhood and betrayal, of trust that should never been given or that should never been broken, depending on the moment of the dream. He dreamed of his brothers, of Horus and Gilliman and Russ, of all the relationships he had never quite managed to navigate correctly. He dreamed of the Emperor, of cold purpose and missions given and completed, of a father who was not a father and a son who was not quite a son. And slowly, gradually, the Lion began to wake. When the Lion opened his eyes for the first time in 10,000 years, the first thing he saw was a Watcher in the dark. The small robed figure stood at his bedside, its face hidden deep within its cowl. It had waited there, motionless, for however long it had taken. Now it simply observed as the Lion's consciousness returned, as awareness gradually spread through his massive frame, as he remembered who and what he was. The Lion tried to speak and found his voice a ruined rasp. He tried to move and found his body weak, atrophied despite the preservation technologies. He was alive, but he was far from whole. It would take time to recover, time to rebuild the strength that had once let him fight Primarchs and monsters alike. But he was alive, against all odds, despite Luther's final attack, despite the destruction of Caliban, despite 10,000 years of stasis. The Lion lived. The Watcher in the dark gestured, a surprisingly human motion from such an alien being, indicating that the Lion should not try to rise yet, that he should rest, heal, recover his strength. There would be time for everything else later. And so the Lion, who had never been patient in his life, forced himself to remain still, to let his body heal, to gradually work his way back to the strength and capabilities he had once taken for granted. As he recovered, the Watchers showed him things. They brought him recordings, data slates, historical records. They showed him what had become of the Imperium in his absence. They showed him the Codex Astartes and the breaking of the legions. They showed him the millennia of warfare, the slow decay of everything the Emperor had built, the endless grinding wars that had consumed the galaxy. They showed him what had become of his sons, the Dark Angels, obsessed with hunting the fallen, secretive and paranoid, trusted by none. The Unforgiven chapters, spread across the galaxy, all bearing the same shame, the same obsessive need to capture and redeem their traitor brothers. They showed him the current state of the Imperium. The cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, tearing the galaxy in half. Chaos ascendant. Xeno's empires on every border. The light of the Astronomicon flickering. Humanity on the brink of extinction. And the Lion, watching all of this with those cold, calculating eyes that had seen horrors in Caliban's forests and on 1,000 battlefields, came to a conclusion. He understood with perfect clarity what needed to be done. He needed to return. But the Lion did not simply rush forth the moment he was healed enough to walk. That would have been the action of Russ or Onron, or one of his more impulsive brothers. The Lion was not impulsive. He was a hunter, and a hunter plans. He needed to understand the current strategic situation, needed to know which threats were most pressing, which assets were available, which forces could be trusted. He needed to know what had become of his other brothers, which had returned, which had been lost, which still slept. The Watchers helped him, providing information they had gathered over millennia. Through them, he learned that Robert Gilliman had awakened and now served as the Lord Commander of the Imperium, that Gilliman had made changes, instituted reforms, tried to save what could be saved of the Emperor's vision, that his brother, whom he had never quite understood, had become the Imperium's greatest hope. This presented a problem. The Lion's relationship with Gilliman had never been warm. They had respected each other's abilities, but clashed on methods and philosophy. How would Gilliman react to the Lion's return? Would he see it as a help or as a threat to his authority? Would their old rivalry resurface at the worst possible moment? The Lion considered his options carefully. He could reveal himself to his chapter, take command of the Dark Angels, and march forth to join Gilliman. That was the obvious choice, the choice of a warrior eager to return to battle. But it was not the choice the Lion made. Instead, he chose to remain hidden, to work from the shadows, at least initially, to observe the current situation, to understand the new reality of the 41st millennium before committing himself to any particular course of action. It was the same calculated approach he had used during the heresy, the same strategic caution that had led him to secure the Thrombus sector before moving to Terra. And perhaps, deep down in a place even he didn't fully acknowledge, it was also fear. Fear of what his return might mean. Fear that he would make the same mistakes again, that his inability to connect with others would lead to more betrayal, more disaster. Fear that the galaxy he was returning to would not want him, would not need him, would be better off without him. But those were emotional considerations, and the Lion did not think in emotional terms. Or so he told himself. When the Lion finally emerged from the rock, it was not with fanfare or announcement. He simply left, taking with him only his armor, his sword, and a small team of watchers in the dark who insisted on accompanying him. He did not inform the chapter master. He did not take command of his legion. He simply disappeared into the galaxy, a ghost in the past hunting in the present, and he began to fight his own war. The Lion moved through the Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off from Terra by the Great Rift. Here, where the light of the Astronomicon could not reach, where Imperial forces struggled in isolation against overwhelming odds, the Lion appeared like an avenging angel. A chaos warband besieging an Imperial world would find their leaders dead in the night, killed with such precision and silence that none knew what had struck them until too late. A Death Guard plague army would discover their corruption failing, their sorcerers slain, their plague cauldrons destroyed by a warrior who struck from the shadows and vanished before they could respond. An Orkwyak would find its war boss dead, killed in single combat by a lone warrior who would walk through their entire army to reach his target. The Lion fought like he had fought in Caliban's forests, alone, patient, absolutely lethal. He needed no army, no legion, no support. He was a hunter, and the galaxy was full of prey. Reports began to filter back to Imperial command. Stories of a massive warrior in green armor appearing where the fighting was thickest, turning the tide of impossible battles, then vanishing before thanks could be offered or questions asked. Some identified him as a space marine, though his armor was of an ancient pattern. Some claimed he was a demon or an angel or a ghost. A few, a very few, began to whisper a name they had not spoken in 10,000 years. But the lion remained hidden, unknowable, a rumor and a legend rather than confirmed fact. He fought his war on his terms, trusting no one, working alone, doing what he had always done best, solving problems through the application of overwhelming violence at precisely the right moment. It could not last, of course. Eventually, inevitably, the truth would come out. Eventually, he would have to face Guilliman, face his chapter, face the reality of his return. But for now, in these early days of his resurrection, the lion allowed himself to simply be what he was, a weapon, a hunter, the Emperor's first, doing what he was made to do. And in the darkness between stars, in the places where humanity's light barely reached, the enemies of the Imperium began to learn fear. There was something hunting them, something old, something lethal, something that killed without mercy or hesitation. The lion had returned, but as he fought, as he moved through the darkness of the 41st millennium, the lion found himself thinking about things he had never considered before. 10,000 years of dreams of unconsciousness, of hovering between life and death, had done something to him, had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. He thought about Luther, about how his closest friend had felt abandoned, cast aside, left to rot on Caliban while the lion pursued glory. And the terrible thing was, from Luther's perspective, that was true. The lion had left her behind, had never understood what that meant to someone who had given everything to help him, to teach him, to make him more than a beast. The lion had thought he was being practical. He had thought he was allocating resources efficiently, but he had never considered, had never even thought to consider, what might feel like to be the one left behind. He thought about his brothers, about Guilliman, who had tried to befriend him and been rebuffed, about Russ, who had laughed at their fight while the lion had remained cold and distant, about all the relationships he might have had, the bonds he might have formed, if only he had understood that such things mattered. He thought about his legion, about how his own personality, his isolation and secretiveness had imprinted itself on them, about how they had become just like him, efficient, deadly, and utterly alone, about how his inability to connect had created a chapter that could not connect either, that kept secrets even from itself, that trusted no one and was trusted by none. And for the first time in his life, the lion felt something that might have been regret, not for his tactical decisions. Those had been sound, or at least defensible, but for his emotional blindness, for his inability to understand that people needed more than missions and efficiency, for never learning how to be anything other than a weapon. It was too late to change the past. Luther was lost in madness, kept in a cell deep in the rock, a broken reflection of what he once had been. The lion's other brothers were dead, or scattered, or changed beyond recognition. His legion had spent 10,000 years becoming something he barely recognized. But perhaps it was not too late to change himself. Perhaps the lion who had been raised by beasts, who had learned to survive alone, who had spent his entire existence isolated from those around him, could learn something new. Perhaps he could learn to be more than a hunter. The 41st millennium was a cruel place for such self-reflection. The lion could spend hours contemplating his past mistakes, but the moment he entered a war zone, all such considerations vanished. There was the enemy, there was the mission, That was all that mattered. And yet, something was different now. In small ways, subtle ways, the lion found himself making different choices than he would have made before Caliban, when he saved an Imperial Guard regiment from certain death. He stayed long enough to speak with their commander, not for long, just a few moments, acknowledging their courage, ensuring they understood they had not been saved by some faceless angel, but by a warrior who recognized their sacrifice. It was a small thing, meaningless in the grand scheme of the galaxy's wars. But the commander wept when he departed, and the story of the ancient warrior who had spoken words of honor to common soldiers spread far. When he encountered a world besieged by chaos, he did not simply kill the enemy leaders and leave. He stayed for 3 days, helping to organize the defense, teaching their PDF commanders tactics they could use after he was gone, ensuring they had a chance to survive rather than simply delaying the inevitable. It was inefficient. It cost him time he could have spent on other missions. But something in him insisted it was the right thing to do. When he met a group of dark angels who did not recognize him, for his armor was ancient and his face had never been widely depicted, he watched them work, watched how they fought, watched how they related to each other, or rather, how they failed to relate to each other. And he saw in them the flaws he had given them, the isolation and paranoia and secretiveness that he had made part of their genetic legacy. And it hurt. It actually hurt, in a way he did not fully understand but could not deny. The moment of revelation, when it came, was not dramatic or grand. There was no great announcement, no formal ceremony. It was simply the lion standing on a battlefield after another victory, removing his helmet and allowing himself to be seen. The dark angels who had fought alongside him, not knowing who he was, simply grateful for the aid of what they assumed was an ancient hero of their chapter, stopped in shock. They recognized the face from statues and paintings 10,000 years old. They recognized the lion's sword at his side. They recognized the impossible truth standing before them. Their Primarch had returned. The news spread like wildfire, from that single squad to their company, from their company to their chapter, from their chapter to all the unforgiven, and from the unforgiven to the entire Imperium. The lion lived, the first had returned, and the galaxy, besieged on all sides by darkness and horror, allowed itself a moment of hope. If one Primarch could return, if the lion himself walked again after 10,000 years, then perhaps all was not lost. Perhaps humanity could still be saved. When the lion and Gilliman finally met again, it was on a world called Avalis, deep in Imperium Nihilus. Gilliman had brought a crusade force to relieve the sector. The lion had been fighting there for months, gradually pushing back the forces of chaos. They met in a council chamber hastily converted from a ruined cathedral. No fanfare, no ceremony, just 2 Primarchs, brothers who had not seen each other in 10 millennia, standing face to face with the weight of history between them. For a long moment neither spoke. They simply observed each other, 2 transcendent beings, 2 sons of the Emperor, processing 10,000 years of absence and change in an instant. Gilliman broke the silence first. "You're late." The lion actually smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible, but it was there. "You're one to talk. You were dead for most of it." And just like that, some of the tension bled away. They were not enemies. They were brothers, and they had both returned to a galaxy that desperately needed them. Their old rivalry, their old clashes of philosophy and method, seemed suddenly petty in the face of the darkness threatening to consume everything. They spoke for hours. Gilliman shared what he had learned since his awakening, the political realities of the current Imperium, the threats arrayed against them. The lion shared what he had observed fighting in the Nihilus, the true extent of the chaos incursion, the desperate situation of the isolated Imperial forces. And something remarkable happened. They listened to each other, truly listened, not just waiting for their turn to speak. Gilliman heard the Lion's tactical assessments without dismissing them as cold or callous. The Lion heard Gilliman's political considerations without dismissing them as bureaucratic weakness. "I've been thinking," the Lion said at one point, the words feeling strange on his tongue because he so rarely shared his thoughts unbidden, "about Caliban, about Luther, about how I failed to understand what he needed from me." Gilliman looked at him sharply. This was not the Lion he remembered, cold, distant, uninterested in such considerations. "I left him behind," the Lion continued. "I thought I was being practical. I thought I was giving him an important duty. But what I was really doing was abandoning someone who had given me everything. We all have regrets," Gilliman said quietly. "If we could go back and change things." "I can't go back," the Lion interrupted. "But I can try to be different going forward. I can try to do better, to be more than just a weapon pointed at the enemy." Gilliman studied his brother for a long moment. "You've changed. I've had 10,000 years to think about it, most of it unconscious. Sometimes that's when the best thinking happens." It might have been a joke. From the Lion, who rarely joked, it was certainly an attempt at one. And Gilliman, despite everything, despite the weight of the Imperium on his shoulders and the darkness threatening to consume it all, laughed. In the days that followed, the two Primarchs worked together in a way they never had during the Great Crusade. Gilliman's strategic brilliance and organizational genius, combined with the Lion's tactical precision and operational effectiveness, to devastating effect. They coordinated their forces, Gilliman managing the logistics and political realities while the Lion led the actual combat operations. It was not perfect. They still had disagreements. Gilliman sometimes found the Lion's methods too harsh, too willing to accept collateral damage in pursuit of objectives. The Lion sometimes found Gilliman too concerned with politics and perception, too willing to compromise for the sake of maintaining alliances. But they made it work. More importantly, they were willing to work at making it work, to listen to each other's concerns, to find compromises, to recognize that neither of them alone could save the Imperium, but together they had a chance. The Dark Angels, watching their Primarch interact with Gilliman, were confused at first. Where was the cold distance they expected? Where was the superiority and isolation? This Lion was different from the one they had been told about in their chapter histories. He was still the same tactical genius, still the same deadly warrior, but there was something else now, something that might have been wisdom, earned through millennia of isolation and regret. And slowly, cautiously, the chapter began to change. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in small ways, the Dark Angels started to become less isolated. They started to work more effectively with other chapters, with other Imperial forces. They started to trust, even if only slightly, even if only in small ways. The hunt for the fallen continued, of course. That obsession, born of shame and guilt, could not be set aside so easily. But the Lion brought new perspective to it. He ordered his sons to consider the possibility of redemption, of brothers brought back to the fold rather than simply killed or imprisoned. He reminded them that Luther himself had been corrupted, that not all the fallen had chosen betrayal willingly. It was a controversial decision. Many of the Dark Angels could not accept it, could not let go of 10,000 years of absolute judgment. But others saw in it a chance for something they had not had in millennia. Hope. Hope that their shame could be redeemed. Hope that their obsession could end. Hope that they could be more than hunters of their own shadows. But for all the changes, for all the personal growth and new alliances, the lion remained its core what it had always been, a weapon of war. And in the 41st millennium, weapons of war were desperately needed. The lion took command of crusade fleets, leading them into the darkest regions of the Imperium Nihilus. He fought demons and traitor Astartes, orcs and tyrannids, all the horrors that the galaxy could throw at humanity. And he won, battle after battle, campaign after campaign. The lion pushed back the darkness, reclaimed lost worlds, saved populations that had thought themselves abandoned. He fought with the same cold efficiency he had always possessed, but now there was something else. Now he fought not just because it was his purpose, but because he understood what was at stake. He had seen the Imperium at its height during the Great Crusade. He had seen it decay over 10 millennia. He understood, in a way he never had before, that every world saved, every life preserved, every battle won actually mattered, not just tactically, but in the larger struggle for humanity's survival. The Emperor had created the Primarchs to be weapons. The lion was the first of those weapons, the prototype, the proof of concept. He had been designed to be a perfect instrument of war, and that was exactly what he had become. But weapons could choose their purpose. Weapons could understand why they fought. And the lion, changed by 10,000 years of dreams and regret and hard-won wisdom, had finally learned what he was fighting for. Not for the Emperor's vision of human supremacy, not for the glory of the Imperium, not even for duty or honor or any abstract concept. He was fighting for the people, the ordinary humans who lived and died in the darkness, who struggled to survive in a galaxy that wanted them dead, who deserved better than to be forgotten or abandoned or used as mere resources in someone else's war. He was fighting for the soldiers who followed him into battle, the PDF troops and guard regiments who faced horrors that would break lesser beings. He was fighting for citizens of besieged worlds who looked to the sky hoping for salvation. He was fighting for his own sons, the Dark Angels and their successor chapters, who deserved to be more than haunted by the sins of their past. He was fighting because someone had to, and he was uniquely capable of doing so effectively, but also because he had finally learned that fighting meant something more than simply killing enemies. It meant protecting what you valued. And the lion, who had spent so much of his life not valuing anything, had finally learned to value the Imperium he served. Late at night, when the battles were done and his forces had stood down, the lion would sometimes find himself alone on the command deck of his flagship, looking out at the stars, and he would think about who he was, what he had been, what he had become. He was still the hunter, still the warrior born in darkness, still the weapon crafted by the Emperor to fight humanity's wars. Those things could not be changed, were woven into his very being at a level deeper than conscious thought. But he was also something more now. He was a leader who understood that leadership meant more than tactics and strategy. He was a brother who had learned, too late, the value of brotherhood. He was a son who finally understood what his father had been trying to build, even if he disagreed with the methods used. He was the first, the Primarch who had been found first, who had led the First Legion, who had stood at the Emperor's side longest. For so long, he had resented that designation, feeling that it had brought him nothing but being overshadowed by his more charismatic brothers. But now he understood what it truly meant. To be first meant to be the prototype, the test case, the one who bore the burden of finding the path. He had failed at that during the heresy, had let his tactical mind override the emotional and political realities of a situation. But he had a second chance now. He could be first in a new way, not the first to be found, but the first to show that Primarchs could learn, could grow, could change. He was Lion L. Johnson, the lion the warrior who had hunted in Caliban's forest and learned to survive alone, the Primarch who had fought across the galaxy and never quite understood his place in it, the first who had disappeared for 10,000 years and returned to find everything changed. He was a hunter, and he always would be, but now he understood what he was hunting for, not just enemies to kill or missions to complete. He was hunting for redemption, for himself, for his legion, for an Imperium that had lost its way. The galaxy was dark, darker than it had been even during the heresy. Perhaps chaos was ascendant. Xeno's empires pressed in from all sides. The Emperor sat on the golden throne, neither alive nor dead, unable to guide his people. Guilliman fought desperately to hold together an empire that wanted to tear itself apart. The forces of humanity were scattered, isolated, struggling just to survive. The galaxy was dark, darker than it had been even during the heresy. Perhaps chaos was ascendant. Xeno's empires pressed in from all sides. The Emperor sat on the golden throne, neither alive nor dead, unable to guide his people. Guilliman fought desperately to hold together an empire that wanted to tear itself apart. The forces of humanity were scattered, isolated, struggling just to survive. But the lion had returned. The first walked the galaxy once more. And where he walked, the darkness receded, at least for a moment, at least for one more battle, at least enough to give hope to those who had none. It would not be enough. One Primarch, no matter how skilled, no matter how dedicated, could not save an entire galaxy. The forces arrayed against humanity were too vast, too powerful, too relentless. The lion understood this with perfect clarity. But he would fight anyway, because that was what he was made for, because people needed him to, because in the end, even if it was futile, even if it was hopeless, even if it changed nothing, the fight itself mattered. He was a lion, the first, the hunter who had learned to value what he protected, and he would not stop fighting until there was nothing left to protect, or until he fell finally and completely, never to rise again. In the forest of Caliban, long ago and far away, a child learned to survive alone in darkness. That child became a warrior. That warrior became a Primarch. That Primarch became a legend. And that legend, after 10,000 years, became something more. He became the lion, not just a name, not just a title, but a symbol of endurance, of strength tempered by wisdom, of the possibility that even the most isolated, the most damaged, the most seemingly beyond redemption could find a path forward. His story was not over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There were battles still to fight, enemies still to destroy, worlds still to save. There was a brother to work with, a legion to redeem, an Imperium to preserve against overwhelming odds. But for now, in this moment, the lion allowed himself something he had rarely permitted in his long, long life. He allowed himself to rest. Not sleep, not yet, but rest. A moment of peace between the storms of war. He was home, not on Caliban. That world was gone, destroyed by his own choices. But home in a deeper sense. Home in the purpose he had finally understood. Home in the knowledge of who he was and who he had become. The lion, the first, the hunter who learned to protect what he valued. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, that was enough. Though that is a story for another time.